We shall get started. Hello, welcome to the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center's Curator's Corner. I'm Thorin Tritter. I'm the Museum and Programming Director at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center, located in Glen Cove, New York. This online program, as many of you may know, is part of a weekly series of short programs or short presentations that I make about particular objects in our collection at a time when our building's closed. As always, let me encourage you to pose any questions you have during my presentation by clicking on the Q&A button and typing your questions in. Hopefully I'll be able to answer them either during the presentation or at the end of the program. Before I begin today, as I have been doing for the last month or so, I would like to remind you of an appeal that we are making to try and raise $20,000 to support our online programs for the fall. We're trying to get 200 people to make $100 donations. So please go to our website at www.hmtcli.org and click the Give Now button. It'd be very helpful. Today, I'm going to talk about a watercolor painting that hangs in our children's gallery. The painting was made by Marietta Gruenbaum while she and her family were interred in the Nazi ghetto and camp in Theresienstadt near Prague. Before I talk more about her, let me put in a special thanks to her brother, Michael Gruenbaum, who preserved this painting and a number of other materials that document the family's life in Theresienstadt. Okay, here's the caption we include with the painting in our gallery, which I guess pretty much repeats what I just said. Marietta Gruenbaum was a teenager in Theresien when she painted this watercolor in 1943. She and her mother and her younger brother spent 2.5 years in the camp. Miraculously, all three survived the Holocaust. Let me begin by giving some background about the family. Marietta Gruenbaum was born in Prague on July 24th, 1926, the daughter of Carol and Margaret Gruenbaum. Marietta's brother, Michael, was born 4 years later in 1930. This picture shows the children in 1933. Carol, Marietta's father, was a successful attorney, enabling the family to live in a large apartment in an elevator building in Prague. They also had an automobile, which was parked in a garage down the road. So they were a thriving, successful family. Prague in 1930, I should say, was home to a small but flourishing Jewish community of about 35,000 people in a city of 850,000 residents. After 1933, when Hitler came to power and the Nazis rose to power in Germany, there was an influx of German Jews coming into Prague, fleeing from Germany, raising the city's Jewish population to somewhere around 55 or 56,000. But the Jewish population in Prague still remained not much over 5% of the total city's population, so only a small minority in the city. The thriving Jewish community suffered, however, in 1938, when Hitler turned his expansionist eyes toward Czechoslovakia. Hitler was initially interested in the portion of Czechoslovakia closest to Germany, known as the Sudetenland, which had been carved out of the defeated Austrian-Hungarian Empire after World War I and incorporated into the newly created nation of Czechoslovakia. When the lines were drawn after World War I, more than 3 million Germans, representing about 1/5 of the new Czech population, were included in Czechoslovakia. Here's an ethnographic map from 1937. And you can see, at least linguistically, Austria was a good fit to merge with Germany. And you can see the northern and western portions of Czechoslovakia also shared a common language with the Germans across the border, more so than with their fellow countrymen. As early as 1933, Germans in the Sudetenland created a political party that advocated for the autonomy from Czechoslovakia. Over the next 5 years, their calls became louder and Hitler increased his support for them. By August of 1938, Hitler had moved troops to the Czechoslovakian border and threatened war. It was in that atmosphere that the Prime Minister of England, Neville Chamberlain, and the French Prime Minister, Edouard Daladier, and the Prime Minister of Italy, Benito Mussolini, began discussions and shuttle diplomacy with Hitler to avoid war. Notably absent from those discussions were any representatives from Czechoslovakia itself. When the final agreement, known as the Munich Agreement, was reached on September 30th, 1938, there was similarly no Czech signature on the document. The other European powers largely agreed to Hitler's demands, allowing Nazi Germany to occupy the Sudetenland by October 10th, only 10 days later, and allowing for an international commission to explore the breaking up of other parts of Czechoslovakia. Less than 6 months later, the rest of Czechoslovakia got carved up, with the Nazis claiming much of the territory, including Prague, as part of the newly formed protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. Marietta's father was in England when the Nazis marched into Prague in March of 1939 and could have chosen to stay safely away. But of course, he returned to Czechoslovakia to be with his family. Like in other German-occupied territories, the Nazis quickly imposed a series of limitations and restrictions on the Gruenbaums and the rest of the Jewish population of Prague. They were forced to register their names and provide a list of their assets. Karol, Marietta's father, was forced from his job, and the family was required to wear yellow stars whenever they went outside to visibly mark them as Jews. Next, their home, car, and most of their possessions were confiscated, and they were forced to move into a much smaller apartment. After 2 years of surviving gradually worsening conditions, Karol was arrested by the Gestapo in October of 1941. He was interrogated and then sent to the Small Fortress, a military fortification that the Nazis had converted into a prison near the walled city of Theresienstadt. Shortly after arriving at the prison, he was murdered. Marietta, her brother, and her mother remained in Prague for another year before they were deported to Theresienstadt, not to the Small Fortress prison, but to the walled city itself, which by then had been converted into a Jewish ghetto and forced labor camp that the Nazis had renamed Theresienstadt. The decision to make Theresienstadt into a ghetto and camp was formalized 9 months before Marietta, Michael, and Margaret received their deportation orders. It was arranged at a meeting held in a villa in Wannsee on the outskirts of Berlin in January of 1942. At the Wannsee conference, Reinhard Heydrich, one of the most powerful figures in the Nazi hierarchy, had gotten broad agreement from the departments of the Nazi state about the implementation of the mass murder of all the Jews of Europe. But in the agreement, it was decided that German Jews, particularly those with friends in high places or who had served with distinction in World War I, or whose disappearance might be problematic in some way, those would be deported to a special ghetto, Theresienstadt, rather than being sent to one of the killing centers. While saved from immediate death, deportation to Theresienstadt was largely also a death sentence. The German Jews were crowded into dormitories in Theresienstadt with minimal concern for hygiene and a strict limitation on food, creating starvation conditions. By the time the Gruenbaums arrived in Theresienstadt in November of 1942, more than 53,000 Jews had been sent to live in a town that had been home to less than 8,000 people before that, a year before that. It's hard to imagine the overcrowding. 53,000 people in a city designed for 8,000. During the next 18 months, regular deportations took Jews from Theresienstadt north and east to killing centers and other camps in Poland. Meanwhile, more Jews were brought into Theresienstadt from Germany and other areas south and west. Mass deportations to Theresienstadt ended somewhere in the middle of 1943. By then, the crowded conditions had eased, but only because of the combination of high death rates and outward deportations to places like Auschwitz and other death camps. In June of 1944, when international pressure finally pushed the Nazis to allow the Red Cross to come and inspect Theresienstadt, the combination of starvation, disease, and deportations to killing centers made it possible for the Nazis to make Theresienstadt appear as a model ghetto. And the Red Cross inspectors bought the lie hook, line, and sinker, enabling Hitler to sustain the falsehood that he was simply resettling the Jews in camps like Theresienstadt. With the Red Cross visit over, of course, the deportations to killing centers continued, so that by end of October 1944, only 11,000 residents remained in Theresienstadt. In all, some 140,000 Jews were transferred to Theresienstadt between 1941 and 1944, nearly 90,000 of whom were then deported to points further east in almost certain death, while roughly 33,000 died in Theresienstadt itself. Marietta, Michael, and their mother, Margaret, all miraculously survived. Marietta's aunt, however, who came to Theresienstadt with Marietta, did not. She was included in one of the early deportations out of the city, but she made an arrangement with Margaret that if she could send a letter back, she would include a code. If her letter were written on a slant going up, it would mean that all was well in the new location and that she was fine. If, on the other hand, the letters slanted down, it would mean that there was trouble. Shortly after her sister-in-law was deported, Margaret received this letter from her. You'll note the slight downward slant of the words. She was sending the signal that deportation was not for the better. I will add that, I must have been difficult for Margaret to read this letter. First, because she would have known that her sister-in-law was in trouble. And second, because she then realized that the hell she and her children were living in was actually better than the alternative, better than anything else. And let me add here that we at the HMTC have a collection of postcards from Theresienstadt in our museum, which may well include coded messages like the one arranged by Margaret and her sister-in-law, but unlike in the case with Margaret, we don't have the answer key. We don't know what in the postcards are a secret message. But we know that it's likely that there were codes included in the texts of our postcards that only the recipients, and not any German censor who might be reading them, would understand. For Margaret, the knowledge that deportation meant something worse than the conditions in Theresienstadt was crucially important information, which she was able to use later to save the lives of herself and her children. This picture shows Marietta and Michael at a family gathering with some friends a year before the Nazis invaded Prague and 4 years before Marietta and her brother were sent to Theresienstadt. Michael stands in the front with his father seated to his right, wearing the light-colored fedora. Marietta is in the background on the left side of the table with her arm around her mother. The photograph captures the family at a moment of joy, blissfully unaware of the terrors that the future would hold. In the ghetto, all 3 of the surviving family members of the family were forced to do slave labor. Marietta, who had turned 16 a few months before they arrived in Theresienstadt, worked in the camp laundry. Michael, who came to the camp at the age of 12, was placed in a dormitory with other young boys and worked in the garden or later as a delivery boy for a bakery. He was not allowed to stay with his mother. And Margaret worked in the arts department, making artificial flowers and toys that were sent back to Germany. In November of 1944, after surviving for 2 years in Theresienstadt, Margaret was in charge of a group of workers making teddy bears that would be sent to the families of German soldiers. That's when she got a notification that she and her children would be placed on the next deportation train out of Theresienstadt. Aware that deportation likely meant death, she went to her supervisor, a fellow Jew, and told him that if she was deported, the quota of teddy bears that had been required would not be met. He then went to the German officer in charge and told him, according to Michael's later testimony, "If you want these teddy bears, you better pull this lady off the transport." The move paid off, as the officer signed a slip of paper that excused Margaret, Marietta, and Michael from that deportation, expecting them to be placed on the next one. But no other deportations were held before the Russians liberated Theresienstadt the following spring. Delaying her family's deportations, in this case, saved their lives. So that's the background for this painting by Marietta. We believe it was painted in 1943 when Marietta was 17 years old. She had watched as her family possessions had been ripped from them, lived through her father's murder, and been forced to move to the crowded camp of Theresienstadt, where she was surrounded by death. The watercolor by Marietta is one of several pieces of art that were included in an album that Margaret created in the immediate aftermath of the war, and which Michael safeguarded for many years thereafter. This piece, like much of the art done by children in Theresienstadt, captures some of the hints of the violence that surrounded Marietta, with blood on the man's face and the lightning bolt carving down through the sky in the background. As to more about what Marietta tried to depict in the picture, or if there was more meaning to it, we don't really know. This is another piece that we show in our gallery that also comes from the same album created by Margaret and kept by Michael. A lightning bolt appears here, much like in Marietta's piece, although here wielded as a weapon in a battle against a far smaller adversary. The poem translates, as you can see, "Further and further, always further. The battle for life pierces the armor. Don't worry about thunder. Accept the blows as they come closer and closer. Do not give in." It's signed by a Peter Gans, who was another boy in the dormitory where Michael was living. The fact that children in Theresienstadt were able to make art may seem surprising, particularly when we think of the conditions in places like Auschwitz or other camps. But Theresienstadt was a strange combination of work camp and ghetto, somewhat similar to other ghettos in places like Lodz or Warsaw before those were liquidated. And in Theresienstadt, like in those other ghettos, the Jewish residents tried to sustain the arts and their rich culture regardless of the depredations they were living through. Theresienstadt was also somewhat unique because it was where many of the most well-educated German Jews who were well-connected in Germany were sent, including musicians, painters, poets, and writers. This population helped enrich the cultural life of the ghetto, composing and performing musical pieces, holding religious observances, and offering a series of open and secret art classes for children. Since the end of the war, the children's paintings from Theresienstadt in particular, like this one from Marietta Gruenbaum, have captured much public attention. In addition to the intrinsic value of the art, some of the works capture perspectives of life in the ghetto, offering a firsthand source about the living conditions in a place where the Nazis covered over the history with their own PR. But from a larger perspective, the fact that both children and their teachers, despite the constant fear of death and deportation, continued to teach, to paint, to learn, and to hope, shows a level of courage and an inner strength that's often forgotten in the larger story of the Holocaust. The children's paintings are very much a product of resistance from a community that sought to sustain life even as they witnessed death all around them. While luck certainly helped to save Margaret and her children, the optimism, hope, and willingness to resist, which we see in Marietta's painting, were also factors. And those attributes also served them all very well after the war. In 1947, Marietta, then 21, came to the United States with the assistance of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee and a B'nai B'rith scholarship to study at the University of Wisconsin. She completed an undergraduate degree and then followed it up with a master's degree in French. She also met her future husband at Wisconsin, and they moved together to Ohio, where she taught for 25 years at Denison University and raised 2 sons. She died in 2008 at the age of 82. Her brother, Michael, and her mother initially remained in Prague, but following the communist takeover in 1948, they headed to Paris and then flew to Cuba to await permission to enter the United States. The picture, as you can see, shows them in Prague in 1948, shortly before leaving the city for Paris. Michael, who was 18 when they arrived in Cuba, earned his high school degree in 2 years at the American High School in Havana. They then received their visas and immigrated to the United States, arriving in New York Harbor on July 4th, 1950. Michael later recalled that as they sailed in, the harbor had a festive atmosphere and there were boats spraying water, all of which he assumed was part of a regular welcome reception for ships like his. Later, he learned, of course, it was for July 4th. Michael went on to study at MIT, served 2 years in the Army during the Korean War, and then earned a graduate degree at Yale. He also got married and eventually raised 3 sons. In 2015, he published a memoir describing his childhood in Theresienstadt entitled "Somewhere There Is Still a Sun." The title captures the optimism and hope that's also present in Marietta's art. Let me close by saying how rare it was for children like Marietta and Michael to survive. During the period from 1941 to 1945, approximately 15,000 children were sent to Theresienstadt. 90% of them were killed. And overall, we know the Nazis murdered 1.5 million children, reflecting how the Nazi ideology blinded men to even a basic level of humanity and concern for the innocent. In addition to having a children's gallery in our museum, where we explore why the ways the Holocaust impacted the youngest members of German and European society, HMTC opened a children's garden in 1998, which was renovated earlier this year. I encourage you, even when our building is closed, to come to our garden and see some of the signage and markers that we've erected to honor the 1.5 million children killed by the Nazis. And when our building reopens, which I hope will be soon, I hope you'll come back and see the painting by Marietta Gruenbaum. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Thank you for watching. And of course, if you have questions, please type them in the Q&A box and I'll try to answer them. Let me take a moment to remind you of some of our other upcoming programs. Next Wednesday at 11 o'clock, I'll be back for my next Curator's Corner when I'll be talking about a tiny X-ray that is part of a document showing a negative TB test taken in one of the DP camps that hints at the concern about tuberculosis and other contagious diseases in the aftermath of the war. Towards the end of the month, let me draw your attention to a program on Tuesday, September 29th at 6 p.m. when we will host an artist talk with Michael Gallmer about his sculpture, The Tears of the Holocaust, which he donated to the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center in 2017. And finally, on Thursday, October 1st at 6 p.m., Christina Chavarria of the US HMM in DC will present the Latin American response to the Holocaust, the examples of the Dominican Republic and Mexico. This is one of a couple of different programs that we have scheduled to mark Hispanic Heritage Month, which began yesterday, and that are being held in collaboration with the Nassau County Office of Hispanic Affairs and La Fuerza Unida, an organization here in Glen Cove. You can find a full list of our upcoming programs at our website, www.hmtcli.org, under the Events tab. And once again, let me urge you to also click on the Give Now button and make a donation to support virtual programs like this. Okay, let me look at some of your questions. How were decisions made about who was deported and who was not? I'm not sure if you're talking about the deportations to Theresienstadt or the deportations out. I think the ones to Theresienstadt, that was made essentially for all the Jews in Prague. They were gradually sent to Theresienstadt because it was the closest ghetto. In terms of being sent from Theresienstadt to killing centers, that was something that was done by a combination of the Judenrat in Theresienstadt, by the Nazi authorities, based partially on who was working or who might not be helpful to the Nazis, and partially just on chance, on who they could transport next. Were art, culture, and religion allowed by the Nazis, or were they done secretly and against prohibitions? In the ghetto, there was, and in other ghettos, there was a great deal of autonomy left to the Jews despite the starvation conditions and disease. And so in a lot of ghettos, there were the creation of schools, the creation of programs to educate children, and the embracing of art and culture. The situation in Theresienstadt was a little richer than perhaps some of the other cities because of the wealth of knowledge that the residents brought as they were shipped into Theresienstadt and deported to Theresienstadt. But yet some of the references to art classes were done in secret. And so I think there was a sense that some of the freedom of expression that might be shown through the art was something that the Jews in Theresienstadt were worried the Nazis would not like. And so some of those art classes were done in secret. Is Michael still alive? Yeah, I believe Michael is still alive. I think he lives in Massachusetts. And there have been several articles that come out about him, particularly after he published his memoir. One person asked also about, was there more documentation that Marietta shared about her watercolor? And to be honest, I think there was, but I have not been able to find it. It was donated to the US HMM in DC, and they used to have material about the painting on their website and in their collections, but for now it's been moved offline. And I'm not sure if there were inaccuracies in the original material that was online and that's why it was moved, or if it was a technical glitch or something else. But I have not been able to find any additional descriptions by Marietta about her painting and watercolor. Okay, thanks very much for tuning in again, and I look forward to seeing you in some of our other programs soon. And I wish you a lovely day. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.